Now we will switch to the next presentation about life cycle and green procurement towards sustainable lighting by Jessika Richter from Lund University. So Jessika, are you ready?
Ready. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes,
all right, thank you very much. Yes, I'm here to talk today about sustainable lighting from a life cycle perspective and also link it to green public procurement. I have done a PhD around environmental effects and lighting at the IIIE at Lund University, and today I'm going to just give a brief overview of some of the life cycle effects from an environmental point of view, and also how that links to then some policies, particularly this green public procurement. So first of all, when we think about life cycles, what are we talking about here? So some of us, we've heard mentioned throughout the conference about life cycle costs and life cycle with maintenance. But from an environmental perspective, when we're talking about life cycle, also we're talking about where has this lighting come from? How has it been produced? Where have the materials that go into the lighting that we use come from? And what happens to them after we're done using? So use is also part of it, but it's also this kind of secret history or backpack that we have to the lighting and what was put into it in terms of materials, but also the energy used to make that lighting, to mine the materials to make that lighting, as well as then the use stage. Not only are we using energy, but that energy is also coming from somewhere. And how is that energy produced? This is all something we consider when we're looking at environmental impacts. And then also the end of life. So does it go as waste? Is it recycled? What happens? And what are the impacts from those processes? Those are all then outputs that have environmental impacts in different ways. So if I show an example of what we would call a life cycle assessment, what we do when we're thinking about life cycle and the environmental impacts, we take all of these inputs and all of these outputs and put it together into what we call life cycle assessment. And this is an example of one for an LED luminaire used in the EU. And what does this all mean? There's a lot of different bar graphs here. They're all different environmental impacts. So we talk about greenhouse gases, we talk about impacts in terms of air pollution, we talk about ozone, toxicity. We're measuring all of these. And we can also break it down by the life cycle stage. If you see on one part, it talks about EOL or end of life, use, the installation, the transport, and the manufacturing. So thinking about that, these lighting products that we're using have these different stages of their life cycle, which have a variety of environmental impacts. Now, it is Climate Week this week, and there's a lot of attention on the policy level to this particular environmental impact, the global warming potential or the greenhouse gases that come from the life cycle. And you can also do a life cycle assessment that only considers the carbon footprint, as we would call it, or just looking at greenhouse gases. It depends, again, on what the agenda is. And there can be different focuses and different weighting of different impacts. Now, what does this also tell us when we're looking at what matters from an environmental point of view to the lighting that we're using? On average, the largest share, if you see there, the darkest part of the bars there is the use stage. So how we're using and the energy that we're using throughout our use of these lighting products, which is, again, something that we've heard a lot about with energy savings throughout the conference. And that's valid because that is the largest life cycle stage for environmental impacts that we've seen from multiple life cycle assessments. This is for an LED, but we see it the same for other lighting technologies. So this is also a life cycle assessment that compared different lighting technologies, LEDs, fluorescence, incandescence. This again is for home, but we see it also for street lighting, a similar pattern for energy use, increasing as we go backwards in our technology, as we've seen a lot of focus on energy efficiency, and that is valid again for the primary energy consumption that we see gains. And how does this convert then towards this life cycle assessment that I told you about? It means that if we consider those incandescents, which are the blue line on the outside of this spider diagram here, they have the highest impacts from all those various impacts that I talked about, from resource impacts to soil impacts to water impacts to air impacts, because they use a lot more energy, and that energy, again, is being produced somewhere and using these resources and having these environmental impacts. So the less energy use, the less impacts we see across the board, not just in energy-related impacts, but again, our energy also requires materials and has environmental impacts. So we expect to see, as we have improving energy efficiency, we also have lower environmental impacts from a life cycle perspective. Now, I'm going to switch a bit to policies, because policies use this information. So it's not like I'm asking all people to be considering and taking this life cycle perspective, but in fact, the EU policies and many of the member state policies are taking this life cycle perspective in then crafting policies that will then indicate the environmental impacts and try to get rid of the worst performers, let's say. So we see the Eco Design Directive here setting standards, minimum energy performance standards that try to push the market, try to push the worst performing environmentally technologies off the market and try to improve the environmental profiles of products. We also see labeling that is intended to pull and give us information on how we can do that. So right now we have the energy labeling, which will tell us again about that life cycle stage with the largest impacts. And that helps us then pick those technologies that have the least environmental impact. And we see here the estimated 102 terawatt hours a year savings for lighting in 2020 from just these two policies, the Eco Design Directive standards and the labeling. Okay, but also for municipalities, it's very important to consider the procurement. So we've heard about procurement of smart lighting and procurement from different aspects. I'm going to talk about the environmental aspects to green public procurement and what we should be looking for when procuring lighting technologies. Now, green public procurement as a policy is quite important if we think about the amount of money that is spent procuring lighting and street lighting and other services, but it is a quite significant part of the EU GDP that is spent with green public procurement. It is a voluntary process, so it's not something that needs to be done. However, there are already, as I mentioned, studies that are used to underpin the green public procurement criteria. So it is in a way a shortcut if you want to be procuring more sustainable lighting, that you look at what the criteria that have been developed by the EU are as a starting point for this. Again, it's taking a life cycle perspective. It's based on those life cycle assessments that I showed you a bit of at the beginning. So it's kind of a shortcut way to get to how should I use this. Using green public procurement helps you take that life cycle perspective and helps you consider what's important from an environmental and sustainability point of view. So the aim with the green public procurement, kind of like the labeling as well on eco labels, is to pull the market, to indicate how can we find the most sustainable products? What kind of criteria should we be paying attention to? They have core criteria, which would be like, okay, what should I definitely have and be paying attention to? Comprehensive criteria, a bit more ambitious, and award criteria. Maybe this hasn't been developed yet, but you're going to reward some of the companies if they're able to meet additional criteria there, giving them award points. And how it has been working. So there's been already some presentations indicating about life cycle costs, and that underpins, again, green public procurement as well, because usually the life cycle costs are also pertaining to important environmental parts of the life cycle too. So how long is the product lasting? How long is it going to need maintenance, and how is that part of it? So this is part of how long a product will last. The life cycle impacts in the green public procurement have since the beginning focused on energy efficiency, again, showing the outcomes of those life cycle assessments, that use and energy use is one of the largest environmental impacts and driver of the whole life cycle impacts. So it is both the energy efficiency and the lifetime that are very key towards driving the environmental impacts. But I also want to go back to looking at what is the second stage that is driving impacts. The second largest share is in the manufacturing stage. And here we see that it can matter for some more than others. It is mattering more for LEDs as we go towards decreasing energy efficiency we also have increasing manufacturing as part of the life cycle. Another factor that can influence how much that manufacturing stage matters is how much renewable is in the energy mix. So I talked about that the life cycle assessment takes into account not only that we're using energy, but what kind of energy we're using has the impact. So as cities, countries, and the EU go towards a more renewable energy mix, this manufacturing stage actually becomes higher and more relevant. So it is the improving energy efficiencies, the renewable energy mix, but also as we have more complex devices as well. We have more electronics in many of the lighting technologies. Again, this makes them more like electronics than with a higher environmental backpack in the manufacturing. So we have many reasons to be paying attention and increasing attention to this life cycle stage. So if one message I get across here, it's yes, energy efficiency matters. Yes, use stage matters. But we need to start thinking also how we make sure that we're using these as long as we can. And we are thinking about that manufacturing stage. So looking through this, the environmental impact of other stages that I haven't mentioned here. Transport, even though we think about lighting products that now are made with components that come all over the world, still the transport is quite small when we consider all of the inputs and outputs of that manufacturing and the use. Transport is relatively very small. Environmental impacts from the end of life management is also generally low. You can see it here. Hazardous waste is where you see at the top, you can actually see the end of life impacts with hazardous waste. Other categories of impacts, you don't really see the environmental or the end of life impacts having a significant portion of it. That doesn't mean that they're not important. One thing to remember is that the waste, the end of life, is occurring probably locally in your municipality, something that you do need to consider. How is this waste being managed? Again, something that also regulations have considered. So it is, in one case, taken into account. Another reason why the end of life stage matters is with circular economy. Then we heard this phrase used before. The point of circular economy, or one point of it also, is to connect that end of life stage to that manufacturing stage to try to bypass some of the manufacturing. If we can recycle some of the materials, we don't have to extract as many of the materials. If we can reuse some of the components, we don't have to manufacture those components from the or we don't have to manufacture those components from scratch. We can remanufacture those components or refurbish or reuse them directly. So we see in the green public procurement an increasing attention towards the manufacturing stage. But from this point of elongating or making sure that there is a longer lifetime to products. So increasing attention to non-energy criteria, but also increasing requirements for repairability and maintenance. I mentioned that lifetime had always been part of the focus. But as one of the previous speakers also mentioned, we see more and more attention paid and should be paid to what is the rated lifetime? How is this really going to operate with the conditions I have? So they're rated often, even in this criteria, to 25 degrees. And again, from a procurement point of view, it's also asking, okay, make sure that it's fit for your purpose here, but also be paying attention to these maintenance costs, to how it will be repaired. How easy is it to be repaired? The criteria in the green public procurement specifies that it should be with regularly available tools, and that there should be spare parts made available. Warranties should be, you should be looking for longer warranties or some kind of service information as well, because all of these help you ascertain, okay, how valid is this lifetime? And if there are conditions here, can we get help in keeping these technologies in use longer? And this helps spread out, again, that manufacturing stage. We have those impacts, but if we can spread them out over a longer lifetime, we slow the need for those impacts arising again. So there is both this closing the loop through recycling, but there is also a slowing of the loop with circular economy by keeping the materials that are already in use and the technologies longer in use. Other environmental impacts that are considered in the green public procurement criteria relate to lighting pollution, and which I know has been covered in a previous session, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it is in there as criteria. So again, this is not covered by the life cycle assessment. When I talked about all these different environmental impacts, this is not in those impacts at the moment, but it is part, again, of a life cycle perspective in this green public procurement. So they are taking into account all of the information that is available about impacts over a lifetime of these lighting products. So there's criteria around lighting pollution. There was a in-depth discussion in the green public procurement setting that, so they always have consultations with stakeholders, and part of the consultation included a debate around mercury for lighting, and should there be criteria around not having mercury in lighting. And this related to at the EU level, there is a discussion currently about that lighting technologies that use mercury are currently given an exemption by both the ROS regulation, the restriction on hazardous substances, and by the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And the debate is about whether, with LED technology available now, that there needs to be an exemption for mercury technology, because those exemptions are only made that there is not an alternative technology available. That is debatable and arguable now, and it is being argued. So that's something also to pay attention in planning and in procurement, that it wasn't in the criteria this time, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to be in the criteria in the next time, or even part of standards going forward. Another debate that was part of the impacts mentioned was about conflict and critical raw materials that are in lighting products. And I've circled some of them here, orange ones being the critical materials that are on the list for the EU, meaning that there are supply chain risks to these materials. And the conflict materials, gold being one of them, meaning that there is conflict associated with procuring those materials in the upstream parts of products. And here, there has not been a good, let's say, or a clear path on what should be done about this, other than that there should be recycling technologies experimented with to get these materials back. But there has been a move towards maybe we should at least know what materials are in. But I would say that this is not high on the agenda for the green public procurement, because it is complex. So it might be more suited for other, like the WEEE directive and other of the policies going forward. So you might hear about it and hear that it's in lighting products. And again, supply risk, because they're coming from certain countries only, and we don't have a diversified supply to many of the materials that are in our lighting products. They do have high environmental impacts or associated with conflict and social impacts. They don't have high recycling rates. So this goes into the end of life, again, the need to collect these. Again, it's by the WEEE directive, but it's something in the green public procurement that was, can we go beyond the WEEE directive and ensuring that these products are recycled in a good way? And is there something we can do from procurement? It has not made it into the criteria, but it is part of the discussion. And we would expect that the next iteration of them will try to, again, make some criteria that might do something to help gain some of these materials back into the system. So finally, what I want to conclude with is the summary of where it's going here with green public procurement and considering the life cycle perspective for environmental impacts. There's still a focus on energy efficiency. It still is the life cycle stage with the highest environmental impacts. We see minimum standards to push this. We see green public procurement criteria to pull it. We have now increasing focus on other environmental impacts like lighting pollution. Circular economy is on the agenda, so we expect to see more and more criteria and focus on the disassembly, modularity, maybe even the recyclability requirements. Again, I talk about those critical materials that we want to see coming out. And procurement of refurbished lighting and recycled content requirements is also been discussed and maybe on the agenda for the next iteration. Sustainable production and consumption more generally is also on the agenda at the EU level and at many member state levels, with material passports trying to have more transparent information about supply chains and better recycling, procurement of lighting as a service, and ensuring that these energy savings that are made through lighting don't result in rebound and energy use elsewhere, This is all part of the discussion going forward. There are many more questions to be decided. But in the meantime, there is also information on these criteria and guides to how to be more sustainable in our procurement of lighting technologies. You can find guides at the Green Public Procurement at the EU. You can also go to the Lighting Metropolis website, which is a project we've been part of, that also has information both on the life cycle aspects and on green public procurement more generally, and where do you start and how can you do this. And again, I would say start with the criteria there. You don't have to start with knowing all of the backpack if that is new to you and knowing all of the environmental impacts, but start with those criteria which have already considered those impacts from a life cycle perspective and can be used as a guide towards pointing towards what matters from an environmental perspective and a sustainability perspective. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation about GPP and related aspects. Since we are back on time, I think we can have one quick question and a quick reply to that question. So the question is, as you mentioned, GPP is a voluntary process. Do you have any advice, or are there any discussions or debate about making it compulsory? Do you have any information or perspective on this question? Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are some like on a member state level and locally where they do say it's non-compulsory. It is mandatory to use green public procurement, but it is not on the EU level. And I don't see it going quickly towards a mandatory on the EU level. We do have the Eco Design Directive that sets minimum standards. And those we expect to see increasingly becoming more and more ambitious. We also see even the Eco Design Directive standards also incorporating circular economy. So some of the other electronics and appliances like refrigerators now have requirements on provision of spare parts, longer warranties, these and more repair information and maintenance information. And we also see questions around lifetime also there. So we expect almost, I would say, I expect that the Eco Design Directive will be driving that minimum up. So I still expect to see that the green public procurement, for the most part, will remain a voluntary kind of leadership opportunity for municipalities, but they should expect that they're going to be pushed either way by those standards.
All right. Well, thank you very much once again. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.